Okay, we are live. Go up and see, make sure we're really live. Okay, we're really live. Okay, so anybody who sees me today knows I've got a cheat sheet, which I usually don't come up here with because there are so many Bible verses. I want to make sure that I get them all. We may not read the entirety of them all, but we're actually today talking about lessons from Judas. So for backdrop, this kind of came up last minute and I didn't know what I was going to talk about. It became one of those times, like if you've ever heard me say, don't ever ask me where I want to go and eat, because all of a sudden I will not remember a single restaurant I have been to in my entire life. And it'll be like, what's food? Well, pretty much that's what it's like. And so that's what this was kind of like. It was like, okay, so I'm going to be doing a message. What's a Bible verse? And so I'm sitting there trying to think of something. And so then I was going to do this one message that I did a long time ago. But then I realized I never used any notes to do it. I just went up there with a Bible verse. And I said, no, I'm not in the mood for that today. So I kind of segued into something a little bit different. So who follows me on Patheos?
I get your emails.
You get my emails. Okay. Nice thing about Patheos is you can't just get emails from me.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to get emails for everybody else under the same heading. You can just get mine. And we are actually going to work on an email list because social media is always so funny. And if you follow our podcast, the episode premiere will be September 17th, but like the preview episode, kind of like the trailer episode for the season, will be out tomorrow. So I will talk a little bit about the email list on there. But if you follow me on Patheos, I've done a series on the 12 apostles and on who they were, because, they were people. I know that I say that and we're all just kind of laughing, but, they were human beings. They did stuff, and they weren't holier than we are, and they were certainly not smarter than we are, and they didn't have some special pipeline to God. The King's Highway that Chuck talked about was not the highway to heaven, okay? It wasn't like it was any sort of special thing. They were still people. And if you study their histories and if you learn about them, it actually teaches us a lot about the New Testament, and a lot of dialogue makes more sense. And isn't it amazing how things make sense when we learn? Okay, but all of them kind of had their own little unique personalities if you start really reading it. So Peter was kind of bold and kind of brash and kind of foolish a lot of the time, and said things he should have done and cut off some dude's ear when he shouldn't have done that. And, he kind of thought later. He kind of did first and then, kind of thought later. And so there was that. And then you had Philip was kind of a liaison for the Greek community. What we tend to see is that there'd be like a groups of Greeks outside, and they would go to Philip, and Philip would be the one who would go to Jesus and say, hey, these people are here and they want to see you and they want to talk to you. And then we had James and John, who were brothers, and we had Thomas is known forever as doubting Thomas, and actually Thomas asked a lot of really dumb questions in the history of his apostleship. But you want to know what? It's interesting to kind of read that they all had their own little unique things, and that those little details are in there. John was kind of deep and kind of philosophical and kind of petty, if we're going to really read it, because I also took note that John's gospel talks more about Judas than anybody else, and gives us the most detail about Judas, because this is the thing, we talk about Judas, we don't know nothing about Judas. There's no history, there's no real detail, but I, being me, kind of wonder what Judas was like before he betrayed Jesus. And we don't talk about Judas because Judas totally defies all our modern sensibilities. He didn't rat out Jesus because he had a bad childhood or because he had severe emotional problems. He did it because he was mad. And that's sobering, that somebody could be that mad, that vengeance is such a powerful thing that it can change somebody who might have been along for the ride and might not have really been all the way there, but might have been okay, into somebody who was willing to do that. That kind of shocks our world, that if we really are honest with ourselves, any one of us could be Judas. If we were in the right setting and we were in the right situation, and it don't matter what background you come from, it don't matter what side of the tracks you live on, it doesn't matter how much money you have. I'm even going as far as to say it doesn't matter who your teacher was. Jesus was the best in the world, okay? Judas had the best teacher ever, and he still epically failed in a way that he never came back from. And that should be very, very sobering for every single one of us as we kind of explore this. But, you know, it says in the Bible he was numbered among the 12, which means he did all the stuff they all did. He preached the gospel. And so what kind of a preacher was he? And before everybody goes, oh, he was stealing. Yeah, he was stealing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I don't know how to tell you this. One of the best preachers I ever worked with as far as preaching went to jail for larceny 9 years ago. So that doesn't make you a bad preacher. Don't know how to break it all to you. But, you know, he was a preacher. He went out and he healed the sick. And he went out and he raised the dead. And so I wonder, did he do those things? Did he really see people raised from the dead? Did he really work in the same type of miracles everybody else did? And we really don't know, but we can assume from the way it's written that, yeah, he did, because nobody suspected him. There's all these times Jesus is saying somebody's going to betray me, and nobody ever once said, oh, Judas. If they did, they didn't vocalize it, but nobody all looked over at Judas. It says at the Last Supper, they all wondered if it was them, except Judas. Where my message, you think this message is about you, then it is, comes from, because all of them are going, well, is it me? Is it me? And, you know, Judas is the only one with the balls that said, well, surely you don't mean me. Okay, talk about him. Talk about Judas has left the chat. I mean, you know, really, it's like, for real, but what kind of a minister was he when he was sent out with the 12 and he was sent out with the 72? And what was all that like? And we don't know, because by the time they wrote the Gospels, everybody was sick of Judas. Judas was just that one over there. And so there was Peter, and there was John, and there was James, and there was this other James, and there was a Jude, and then there was here, and then there was Judas Iscariot who betrayed Jesus. And every single time they mention him in the group, they put that little info in there. And why was that? Well, because if we're really going to be honest, Judas didn't just betray Jesus. Now, that was certainly enough. I mean, you know, that certainly all by itself was enough. Judas betrayed all of them too. He broke their sanctity and their safe place and all the lessons and the instructions that they were all taught as a group and their cohesiveness and their unity. He broke that up. So they probably had some really bitter feelings about Judas, and it was something that is expressed so deeply in the way that the text is written, it's almost like we wrote him out. But like it or not, Judas is part of the gospel. We couldn't have got to the part where Jesus overcame death if we didn't have Judas do what he did. Now, that doesn't mean it was okay, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, because people debate that because they don't have enough to do. But who was Judas? Okay, who was Judas? Let's go over a couple of really, really brief things about Judas. Okay, it appears he was an outsider. So all the other apostles were from Galilee. They were fishermen, or Matthew was a tax collector, or this, you know, they all were kind of around when Jesus called them. But Iscariot, so Judas Iscariot was known for where he was from, kind of like Mary Magdalene was known from where she was from, rather than actually his family name. So Iscariot means man from Kerioth. So Kerioth is a town in South Judah. I think that it was mentioned in Numbers or somewhere. I mean, you know, it's some nothing, nowhere, who cares kind of place. But he was known as that. We don't have any knowledge of his personal life. And I also kind of think that's interesting. So if he was from South Judea, how did he find Jesus? if they were all there and, they kind of came upon Jesus because that's where Jesus was from, how did Judas enter even this picture? Because notice, we don't have a singular record of the call of Judas. Everybody else, we have a call. So, like, they were fishing and Jesus said, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. And then there was another boat, and Matthew was a tax collector, so he got called off his job. But we don't have any of that record. And so, once again, was there a call? I don't know. Was there a call and they were all just mad because of what happened and they kind of wanted to overlook that fact? I don't know. Or did he just kind of tag along? Which I wonder if that's more than likely what happened, is that Judas was just kind of there. He was there and he was among the 12 and he was numbered among them, as it does say in Acts. And he kind of got the benefit of being there and he kind of got the access to stuff, but we really don't have any formal experience of it. And there doesn't seem to be anything real special or out of the ordinary about his public ministry life. I would think, especially given the way that they kind of talk about him as an afterthought. And I think, once again, that goes to how they felt about what he did. He was part of them. He was numbered among them. They ate with him. They talked with him, just like they did with Jesus. And just like Judas did with Jesus. And they had some kind of way feelings about what he did because he split up the group. Now, he didn't wind up splitting it up forever, but by having Jesus arrested, that changed everything. That changed the dynamic among all of them. But if there was really nothing that special or out of the ordinary, we can only assume that he pretty much did what the rest of them did, that he laid hands on the sick, he preached, he went house to house, because nobody said he was the betrayer. And so just like everybody else, I have a Facebook status that, every now and then people will come on and not like because they don't really think about it. And I said, when it was time to send the 12 out, Jesus still sent out Judas. And when we think about that, that's pretty monumental. That, Jesus knew who Judas was, but they all didn't. And so they all had some kind of way feeling about it. But I believe if there was something he was doing that was notably off, that was notably not appearing like everybody else, somebody would have said something, just simply because they were mad. So, sent out, same power to act. He was the treasurer, which that's kind of an interesting fact, because why was he the treasurer? Why wasn't Matthew the treasurer? Matthew was tax collector. Matthew had the ability to count numbers and count stuff, and so now I guess there is the possibility that no one wanted him to touch money because they all thought they were greedy and stealing, and so there's that possibility. But why Judas? And we don't have any information to know. Was he good with numbers? Did he have some background with this? How did he assume that role? We don't know. So a lot of things, as we can say as we go on here, we don't know. But this is where we can kind of start out looking. And so in Matthew 10, verses 1 through 4, and this is NIV, he called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First Simon, who's called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So there you go. Once again, he's always mentioned last, and he's kind of mentioned there on the tail, but it says he called the 12 and he sent them out. So Judas went with everybody else. And so when they're talking about the incredible things that they're doing, and they're watching the demons cast out of people, and they're watching people here, Judas is there with the same experience that they all had. And so that right there by itself teaches us something about the concept of betrayal. I have studied Judas like 3 major times in my life. And the first time, I'm not going to lie to y'all, I don't remember why I studied it. I think that it went along with everybody at the time was really into the spirit of Jezebel, and that was new. And it was not new long enough to where we could actually step back and think, gee, maybe somebody's not right about this. But I think people were really into spirits. And I was like, well, we're talking about this obscure woman in the Old Testament that people don't even really remember unless they really have some sort of Bible analogy or understanding. I mean, who's really sitting around thinking about, Jezebel? I think that my interest in Judas was that because nobody talks about Judas as being a spirit. And so I kind of was interested in it along those lines. I think that had something to do with my interest in it. And what I went out and came away with is actually not really all that different than what I did now. It's just a little bit different. Then there was a message I forgot I even did that I preached. I didn't preach. I take that back. I thought I preached it, but I didn't preach it. It was in my notes as I was looking for that sermon that I was going to preach that I only went up with a Bible verse for, and I don't have any notes for, that I did a few years ago. I found a message I did called I'm Learning to Serve My Judas. And I came away with that from a period where I was dealing with a minister who basically became a very, very strong Judas figure in the ministry history. And I realized that Jesus served Judas. That when it came time to wash the feet of the disciples, Jesus washed Judas's feet. And Jesus ate his last meal with Judas, knowing what Judas was going to do. And the concept that we have these figures that, with like the Jezebel thing, we want to foresee everything that's going to happen in our ministries. And we want to root stuff out before things happen. We want to prevent inevitabilities a lot of times in ministries. And one of the things that I walked away with that time from it was that we can't. That Jesus had the foreknowledge about what Judas was going to do, and Judas still had to do it anyway. And that sometimes when we deal with things like betrayal, they have to happen. We don't like it. It's not comfortable. It's not stuff that we want to have happen. But it's part of the kind of concept, like we talk about these ancient nations all serving the purpose of God, and then God deals with them later. That for some reason, they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, even though their motives aren't right. And then God deals with the motives after the fact. But it's uncomfortable to talk about Judas like this. It's uncomfortable to say that Jesus foreknew all this and still served. And so we all want to scream and shout and sweat and speak in tongues and spin around the room, and everybody goes away, and we don't have any divisions in our ministries, and we don't ever have Judases or people that cause problems. But it's inevitable, and it's often part of the process. And the answer to deal with it is to serve Judas just like you serve everybody else. And it's not until we're willing to do that that God moves on behalf of our ministries in the way that we want. And that's why an awful lot of people sit in the same storefront for years and years and years and never grow and never go anywhere and never really become anything else, because we have not learned that serving Judas is part of the ministry. We talk about serving Jesus. Well, sometimes serving Jesus is the easy part. It's having to serve Judas where this gets hard. So in the next incident that we see is the instance where he's noted for betrayal, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. We're not going to do that one yet because I did these in the order that I did the thing for Patheos. So let's talk now about Jesus calling out Judas and nobody even noticed it. Nobody even noticed. In John 6, chapter 64, which is a really, really complicated passage, which why if you've never picked up on this, I'm not surprised because there's a lot going on in it. So in John 6, verses 64, another thing, it's a very, very long chapter. This is starting in 64 through 71. Yet there were some of you who do not believe, for Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. So I think that that's interesting that he gave them an out. He even gave, that means, Judas an out. He even gave Judas a chance to confess. But what I'm going to say is I don't think that Judas knew what he was going to do yet. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And Jesus replied, have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil. He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who through one of the 12 was later to betray him. So nobody looked around and said, hey, it's Judas. Hey, it's that one. They all just didn't know who he meant. So it doesn't always look like what we expect. Everybody thinks that the devil should jump up and down with a bunch of horns on his head and wear red and have a pitchfork and go, over here on the devil. It can camouflage and look just like the right situation that comes out in somebody to bring that out in them. And I used to make the joke that people would tell me how wonderful somebody would be. Oh, you've got to meet this person. Oh, they're so anointed. Oh, they're so wonderful. Oh, they're so great. All I did a couple of times was say hi. And all of a sudden, you think I'm laughing, all of a sudden they were a totally different person. They were nasty and they were mean and they were withdrawn and they were saying things they should not say and they were out of line, and I would go, what is this? You know, I'm just standing here minding my own business. All I did was say hi and, you know, or hello or whatever, and you somebody different. And somebody said, well, that's the spirit of discernment. You know, you're just making them all come out. All the devils come out. And I said, well, can't you like stick them back in? I said, or can't y'all maybe like introduce me to some nice people? You know, some people that aren't full of demons. But we often don't know what's inside of us until the right circumstances come out. I mean, you know, I've known a lot of people. There are people that everybody in this room knows who said they'd be around forever and they were never going to go find something else until something else came along, until the right situation presented themselves, and then it became a totally different person. And we don't want to think that this is inside of us, but it is. And that's where we come to self-awareness and where we come to knowing who we are and self-examination. So what brought Judas to this point? Well, John 12, once again, like we say, John had an awful lot to say in hindsight about Judas. John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 reveals to us what happened. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given to Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him, and I just realized Martha served. Isn't that interesting that this is the same woman who Jesus told her, you know, you're worried about too many things, and this is a chapter over and she's still doing the same thing she always did. That's a message. I'm going to have to do something on that. Anyway, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him, well, the first thing I would have been like, look, you rose from the dead. You get up and you get in here. Okay. You ain't dead no more. Get up. Okay. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was going to betray him, just in case anybody had any doubt that that's the one that we meant, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Now that's a little tidbit about Judas that I didn't realize until I studied Judas for Hapios, was that he was keeping back the money for himself. And this was Jesus' response. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. So, interesting. And I think that that's an interesting fact that Judas got called out. And it says that in another passage that that's when he went out and he decided to go find out what they would give him to sell out Jesus. Now, he wasn't treated special. Peter got rebuked a lot. Peter got rebuked probably more than anybody else. Thomas got rebuked. James and John got rebuked because they wanted to sit on the right and the left in the kingdom. Different people in the Bible got rebuked all the time. So I don't know how Judas was with Jesus that long and he thought that he was going to get away with something. First of all, by being that bold, and that's one of the things that kind of struck me about Judas is learning and reading in some of these passages. He was kind of nervy. It was almost like he dared Jesus to say something. It was like, okay, well, you're spending all this money, you're wasting all this money on this anointing oil on your feet, and we could have given that to the poor, knowing what he was going to do with it. Thinking Jesus was just going to let that slide, that Jesus didn't know what was going on. And so that was kind of bold there, that he just, went up and did his thing and didn't really give much consideration to it. It was like, dude, what's the matter with you? But it's like he dared it. He dared Jesus to take a position. And Jesus rebuked him like he did everybody else. And so who was thinking that, even among the apostles, like we say, that wasn't that abnormal. That certainly was not something that Jesus didn't do with everybody. So then one of the 12, and so we're looking at Matthew 26 now, 14 through 16. The one called Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver, and from then on Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So he had a chance to think about what he did. He had time. He could have recanted or decided he didn't want to do it or something of that nature, but it said then he's looking for it. Judas was angry. Judas was mad that he was doing the wrong thing. Okay, and we're going to set this up here really, really carefully. He was mad that he did the wrong thing and he got called out for doing the wrong thing. And I can say whenever I've dealt with betrayal in ministry, that is always every single time what happens. Is that you've got somebody, they doing something they know they're not supposed to be doing. It's not this case where they don't know, and we're real pacifying in church, like we're begging people to belong. It's like, y'all get some discipline here, okay? You know what you're not supposed to be doing because you've been told what you're not supposed to be doing, and you're doing it anyway. And then when it gets called out, everybody's feelings get hurt. In quotes, which nobody can hear that on the podcast, but feelings get hurt, and then they want to go off and they want to find a way to get out of things because they're mad, because they have to deal with some part of themselves that they don't want to deal with. And like I said, time and time again, it's not ever because you were wrong, it's not ever because you were mean, it's not ever because this was some terrible leader. It's because their feelings are hurt now because they aren't perfect and they have to do what they're supposed to do. And so it keeps happening over and over and over again. And then we've got later in Matthew 26 where they're eating. So now Jesus calls this out again. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." So they all didn't know. They're all thinking, "You mean me." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who betrayed him, said, "Surely you don't mean me." Like I said, that's pretty bold. Jesus answered, "You said it." And so then later, verse 47, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man, arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And then Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." And the men stepped forward, seized him, and arrested him. So as we can kind of see through these different passages, we see that Judas moved very, very deliberately. And that being said, from this character that nobody really wants to talk about, nobody really likes, well, what are we left with as we examine the story of Judas? What is there for us to do? Well, the first thing, like I said, is everybody needs to do some self-examination, and we need to examine our own hearts, and we especially need to examine our own hearts when we deal with correction. I am the first one to admit that there are leaders in the world that are not very good leaders, and that don't handle things well, and hurt feelings, and I get all that, okay? And I'm not nullifying that that's a thing that exists, but I'm also going to say, as I've talked about with things like church hurt and so-called religious harm and trauma, which are not really technical terms. There's really no definition for any of these things. They're kind of colloquial things that now people are trying to create programs and quote-unquote therapies for, which is a whole other issue I'm not going to get into. When we start to get into these things, there is also the fact that people lie. And there is also the fact that sometimes people get told not to do something, or they are disciplined and they don't like it, and they don't like that experience. And so they want to go run tell that, and they want sympathy for their story. It's like I've said on Facebook, social media is a haven for people and for issues where people just want attention. And it's not really that anybody did anything wrong to them, it's that they want people to feel bad for them. And I have put up posts more than once because sometimes I knew people that were involved in the situations, and I knew that they didn't do the right thing. But the way that they're making it sound, there was one time, I remember, this is another leader. He wasn't ever part of my ministry, but he was basically a friend that I had. And he hired me to work for him, and I trusted that he was going to pay me to do the work. And I went on and did the work, and he didn't pay me. And several years later, he decides that he's going to pay the bill. And he reached out and he paid it, and I took it, because you want to know what? I went through all that trouble and he didn't make right on it. But he put up a Facebook post about it, and he had to make a big deal how I decided I didn't want to be friends anymore and it was over the money. And I am not kidding. And that he didn't put up my name, but I mean, you know, he put it up, and that how he needed to make it right all these years later. And I put up my own little post in retaliation, because that was for attention, and that was so everybody would come on and go, oh, you're such a good person. And he was making me look bad unjustly, because there's also keeping your word and doing the right thing, and he didn't do that. And I said, if you have to announce on Facebook that you're going to try and make something right 5 years after the fact that you made it wrong, then that's all you're going to get from God, because God is not going to honor that. There was a story Joyce Meyer told years ago about how she had a pin. They all wore the Jesus pins out of rhinestones. I actually have a couple. And that she was supposed to give it to this nurse. They were all at the hair salon. And the nurse said she can't pray with her patients. It's not legal. And that God basically told Joyce, give her the pin, because the patients will be able to see it and it'll be a witness to them. But you have to give it to her privately. So everybody went away, and Joyce didn't do it. And then everybody comes back, and that's when she gives her the pin. And the Holy Ghost said to Joyce, I hope you really enjoyed that, because that's all you're getting. And I think about that story when I think about some of these situations, is that we are very, very quick to jump on a bandwagon based on a Facebook status that it may not even be true. And we all have been in situations where we know people lie. But people get mad, and people have feelings about things. And instead of learning healthy ways to deal with them, we kind of go on another tangent of it. I watched a movie yesterday that, you know, yeah, the people that were causing the offense were absolutely wrong, and they were stealing from people, but vengeance is a very powerful thing, and that movie proved it, because one guy took down this whole empire all by himself. Vengeance can be very, very strong, and Judas teaches us that, whether we like it or not. But as part of the gospel message, we also recognize that Jesus could not have overcome death if he hadn't have died, and that would not have happened without Judas in this particular instance. But that does not mean that Judas performed the will of the Father or did some sort of wonderful thing and that we all are misunderstanding him. Judas did what Judas did because he was mad. And he did it for the wrong reason. And so it might have had a decent end. Just like I've often said, we might overcome whatever people throw at us. We might come to that resurrection point, but that doesn't mean that what you did was okay. It doesn't suddenly get better because we turned out okay. That's not how this works. Wrong is wrong is wrong. And it's like I used the example with the nations earlier. Babylon was still Babylon. Babylon might have executed God's will in overtaking the southern kingdom. Yeah, fell to Babylon. I was doing, is it Assyria or Babylon? It's Babylon. Okay. Babylon was used to fulfill that prophecy. That don't mean that God didn't deal with Babylon in the end. Even Babylon, it says, shall still fall even more if we read Revelation. And so the metaphorical Babylon that kind of has taken over the entire world. So God still deals with what we do. Just because maybe there is a result that's necessary doesn't mean it was okay. And people go, well, what if Judas had asked for forgiveness? Well, Judas didn't ask for forgiveness. So we don't know what would have happened. I mean, do I believe that he would have been forgiven if he would have asked? Probably, because that's who Jesus was. That might not be who Leanne is. Leanne needs to work on that. But as a fact, that's who Jesus was. Probably, maybe, I don't know. But Judas didn't think to ask. Judas didn't get to that point. And if we look at what happened to Judas, which would have been great if I didn't just throw that off, in Matthew 27, 3-5, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. And they said, what's that to us? That's your responsibility. Nice of them, wasn't it? So Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and then he went away and hanged himself. And I'm not going to get into the details on that because there are some that are a little bit more graphic than that, but I don't really feel that that's necessary. He didn't think to ask for forgiveness. Actions have consequences. I think that that's a big lesson from Judas, that we might like to move on and skip down the road and be all okay with everything that we've always done, but it doesn't work like that all the time. But we also have forgiveness, and we also have grace, which Judas didn't have. And we also have hope. In Judas, we can see that hopelessness and despair and being lost and being overcome with the things that have been done are very, very real. But so is grace, and so is forgiveness. And so are all of those things that can turn those situations around. And so we thank God that we have that because he didn't have that experience. We will also be betrayed. Sorry. It's part of the walk. It's part of the life. It's part of being a Christian. It's part of the experience. But there's something very, very powerful, I think, that happens in betrayal that unites us to Christ in his suffering. And what I mean by that is that we are having an experience that Jesus had. Now, maybe we didn't do anything wrong in this situation, but there's probably some situation that we did, and that makes us not Jesus. But it definitely unites us in understanding what that experience must have been like. And from that, we can know because he ultimately overcame it, we can too. Now, maybe it's not going to be in the same way, but that ultimately these things don't have to be the end. Judas did what he did thinking, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to take care of, Jesus is going to get back because he embarrassed me in front of everybody. It's like, really grow up. But, we're going to kind of go that way, and then ultimately led to his death. But in the long run, we're able to see that Jesus overcame that too. Jesus overcame all of it that he experienced. As was mentioned earlier, Jesus didn't treat Judas any differently. And I guess that's kind of where stuff gets difficult. That instead of having the Judas section of the church, where we can, or put a big J on everybody's head, or kind of read things in that kind of light, even if we know that somebody's going to ultimately do something to leave or to betray, we still treat them like everybody else. They still eat with us, they still learn with us, they still study with us, they still have the same opportunity. Judas had every opportunity to be different. He was still given that option. He still could have turned out differently if he had so wanted to. If he hadn't have reacted the way that he did, maybe if he thought about it. And probably the hardest of all of them is the idea that Jesus loved Judas, that he called him friend, that he numbered him among his closest disciples. I mean, he wasn't as close as some of them, but he was close enough that he was there. And you know, the idea though, that if Jesus could love Judas, surely, no matter who we are, or what we are, or where we've been in our lives, Jesus can love us. So that being said, in closing, we need to always remember that those who are betrayed do rise up, while betrayers always face an end. And they typically find an end of their own making. And the more that we move forward, we are better able to understand the love of Christ in all of these different situations, and how we can better turn that into something that will benefit our work for others.